Hi, everybody. Welcome into this week's discussion. Our film we're going to be talking about tonight is The Lighthouse. That was suggested by and introduced by Paul Wright, who joins us. Paul, how are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for suggesting this film and for choosing what I would say so far in almost a year of doing this has to be the single best background image we've had in our going near 50 discussions. So that's something. Um, for those of you who are joining us for the first time or might need a reminder, just to let you know, please keep your audio on mute until I call on you, at which point you can ask your question or make your comment. I will know to call on you because you will use the nifty raise hand function within Zoom that you can see illustrated or indicated with the number 2 there on your screen. Just use that. And at that point, I will call on you by name and you should unmute, please, and make your comment or ask your question. And then please remute while Paul and I respond to it. And we'll just go from there. I'll get to everybody once. I may not be able to get back to people for a second or third comment. Just depends on how many there are and how long we're going. In addition, please feel free to use the chat function within Zoom to introduce yourself, to chat with the fellow attendees and what have you. And if you're joining us from outside of the greater Philadelphia area, we'd really love for you to go to our website and visit the Where in the World section, where you can leave us a message, let us know where you're from, let us know how you found us and how you think we're doing. As you can see from the graphic on screen, we've got folks joining us from all over the country and around the world. And that's one of the silver linings to this whole situation. We can't get together in person, but more people can join us from other places, which I think is really pretty neat. So I think with that, we are ready to get started with our discussion, or at least we will be. There we go. I knew we'd have a few of our regulars ready to go. Joss, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for starting us off.
Okay. Ooh, what's all that noise? Hold on a second.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. I was getting some strange sounds out of my computer gizmo.
No problem.
What an amazing film. I thank Paul for his introductory video, and I had much the same feeling at the end of it. I was speechless at the end, and I had to just sit there for a few minutes and regroup. He touched on so many of the ideas that came to my mind as it went through, so I don't want to repeat them. And I just had a couple of other observations. Paul, in his introduction, talked about elevated horror, which this, I would agree, this certainly was. And one of the choices that was made was to do it in black and white, and not just for some of the other reasons that are clear, as was the aspect ratio and the hearkening back to some of the early horror movies of the teens and 20s and 30s. But I think had it not been in black and white, it would have just been exploitative, because it would have been so gross and disgusting. And I think the black and white imagery didn't ignore that. It just didn't heighten that excessively. Also, the black and white photography was just sublime, I thought. And between the imagery and the sound, the stark, cold environment was just palpable. You felt like you were there. Mm-hmm. And it was relentless and inescapable. And one other brief comment, which is Willem Dafoe's character. There was a line that Robert Pattinson delivered. somewhere in the middle of the film where they were having an argument, and he said to Willem Dafoe's character, "You're a parody." And I was thinking, yes, he was almost a parody of this salty old sailor pirate. I mean, I almost waited for him to say "R" at the end of every sentence. And I just wonder, was this, what was the purpose of that choice? Was his character even really there, or was this whole thing in Pattinson's deranged mind? Okay, so those are the things I had to say.
Well, thanks very much for those comments, Joss. I have to say, I particularly appreciated, I think it's a great question, but I particularly appreciated your comments about the black and white. I love seeing things shot in black and white. I often find, I shouldn't say often, I sometimes find it to be sort of an affectation or a bit of filmmaker indulgence. But here, I think it really, really is essential to the type of movie that Eggers is trying to create. And I think you artfully expressed some of the reasons why. Regarding that line about parody, I have some thoughts, but I know Paul does as well. So what would you say regarding that line that I'm sure stuck out to a number of us?
Well, I want to hear what you say about parody. Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, I I think that, I thought while watching this, and then it was confirmed in reading some things about the film after I watched it, that Eggers was determined to have this movie not take itself quite as seriously as his previous debut film, The Witch, had. And I think there are indications throughout the movie, not that he wanted to make any sort of farce, or not that he wanted to make something that was a sort of, self-referential wink and nod horror, as has so often unfortunately been the case in that genre over the last few decades, but that he wanted, he wanted people to know that he knew that he was giving them a story and that he was telling them a tale. And I think there are a number of moments that sort of go in that sort of hint at that. I'll just say, first off, I think all the flatulence right there. It's hard to take things too seriously when, conversations and silences are punctuated by flatulence, even if it is, as the initial offering from Defoe's character was framed, a show of power. It is still hard to take that entirely seriously. I also found very interesting the shot early in the film when they first get to the doorway to their little building, where the two of them are looking directly at the camera. It's unavoidably a moment of sort of direct address, and we linger on Pattinson looking directly into the camera. Defoe goes inside, and this all entirely makes sense. Even before we see the next shot, it makes sense because Defoe's the more seasoned, wiki. He's been there, so of course he doesn't, bother to sort of take in the momentous, the momentous nature of the moment. He just sort of, oh, I've been here before. It's like anyone who's been somewhere the first time versus someone who goes there all the time. But then we see Pattinson, after looking into the camera with a long time by standards of such shots, we see that he's watching the ship the boat that brought them disappear into the distance. So that sort of explains the moment of direct address. But there's still lots of ways to do that without the direct address. And I think it is a very sort of understated, buttoned down way of basically Pattinson and the film saying to us, you folks are in for something. And he's probably wondering what he's in for, but we should wonder what we're in for. So I think that is sort of, those elements are of a piece with the parody remark.
I think, Andrew, you expressed beautifully the, I think, for lack of a better word, delicate use of humor, including fart humor, in a film that otherwise is doing some serious things and is meant to be a serious experience, but also, as you say, doesn't take it so seriously, itself so seriously that it can't lighten the mood here and there. And one thing I also appreciated about the farts, I can't believe we're starting with these, but hey, why not? I appreciated them because they served to break the tension at appropriate moments, but they also at the same time are very realistic things that I'm sure happen if you're stuck in a lighthouse with somebody, and that happen to all of us in our daily lives. And how many films, I guess for good reasons, don't share that with us, except in, you know, a Farrelly Brothers comedy or something like that. But I appreciate that this film was willing to do that. You know, it has some highbrow intentions, but it also isn't afraid to embrace the lowbrow, parodic quality of all of this. I would also just say, in response to the first comment, the notion that this is all playing out in Howard's head, Robert Pattinson's head, a sort of kind of Fight Club take on the story. I don't know that anyone can tell you not to think that. I also don't know that you have to think that. I think at the end of the day, I may have said this in my remarks, it's a film that's more of an experience than anything else and not a puzzle to decode. And a lot of films are puzzles and want to be puzzles, but I don't think that's what this film is trying to do. Mood, theme, feel, the classical feel of all this that is also generated by the black and white and the aspect ratio. Those are all things that are experiential fundamentally. And so to get bogged down in sort of plot truths, right? I don't know that that really helps us at the end of the day, or put very differently, you're free to take it wherever you want. I think many people have experienced this film in different ways, and not everybody has liked it. And that's fine too.
The other thing I would add is I think there's a way to read that parody remark as not relating to anything I said earlier and not relating to any sort of self-aware element of the film. Haven't most of us encountered someone that if we didn't know better, we would say was a parody of who or what they are? You know, you see the executive of the sketchy company on 60 Minutes and, you know, they're nervously smoking their cigarette and twirling their mustache, and you think, oh my gosh, don't you know that you're the shady executive on 60 Minutes and you look just like the shady executive in 60 Minutes? Or we've met the, you know, you've gone to some sort of, you know, bureaucratic office or institution and you've met the sort of, you know, the almost the parody of the, you know, whatever people say about the DMV, you've met the parody of that. And we see it all the time. How many of you, as someone, and Paul can talk about this, as someone, I've spent a lot of time at colleges and universities over my life. How many people have I met that are a parody of a professor who are just going through their life being a professor? I've met lots of those people. I don't invite them to join me for discussions or to work at the Film Institute, but I have met people, lots of people like that. So that's the other thing that could be going on there, right? That is just, he's just articulating something more directly and boldly, in part because of his level of anger and frustration, in part because as the film goes on, fewer and fewer holds are barred, that we all have thought when dealing with someone, but have, I would wager, in almost all instances, been too polite or too smart to say, well, this isn't a movie, certainly at that point, that's about politeness or intelligence. Let's see. Oh, Robert, you have a question or comment.
Okay, thanks. I just have a couple of things. One of the things that struck me was verticality. Of course, we have this lighthouse, but I just had personally have never seen cinematography where the camera pans vertically up and down so much. I thought that was very striking as a technique of cinematography. There were 3 cliff shots where you're looking up a cliff and then you see the person on top, and then there were shots looking down, and then they were panning inside the lighthouse going up, and then you're looking down, and there's just this verticality that struck me as very interesting, and from a cinematographer's choice. The second thing is I was just struck by, I know that, Professor Wright had talked about the different influences, and one of them was, I think he said Shakespeare in his introduction, but what I saw that struck me was there were 3 really monologues
Mm-hmm.
in this film. When Thomas curses Winslow. I'm going to call him Winslow because there's 2 Toms. So Thomas curses Winslow, and it almost sounded like it came right out of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner,
Or out of Milton or other similar sources. Yeah.
right. And I thought to myself, geez, is this a parody of Coleridge? And then the second one was a monologue where he confessed to what he did in taking Ephraim Winslow's name. And the third was when he called Tom a liar. And anyway, I said, oh my God, this is Shakespeare. And I just haven't seen that, my own experience, I haven't seen where a character consciously takes on a monologue. It just reminded me more of a Shakespeare play. And then I could see the Bible in this whole thing as well. At the end, he has this need to see the light, this mysterious light, and he had to see it. And he went to very great lengths to see it. And he finally saw it. And what happened? It's like he was seeing, well, the Bible says, in the Old Testament, it says, those people who see the face of God will die. And I just thought it was right out of the Bible, that whole last scene where, you dare to look on the face of God. You don't do that.
I really love the comment here, because one of the things I think I mentioned in the intro was biblical invective. So if you look in the books of the Hebrew Bible and the prophets, inveighing against corrupt leaders and the like, that's one of the influences for the cursing here, as well as Shakespeare, Coleridge, Melville, you name it.
Right.
It's just something so powerful. Your comment about the light, I really like as well. It's interesting how this film could speak to my students. I teach a class that's actually named after a class Andrew teaches at BMFI, the aesthetics of film. I think that's the title of your course too, Andrew, right?
We call it the language of film.
Language of film. Anyway, I teach that at university, and I have very young students, and they didn't have all the baggage I had with, biblical invective and Shakespeare and all the rest, and that's fine. What I love though is that this scene, the scene with the light, right, and coming face to face with something forbidden to you.
Right.
It works for someone like me, and you too, I think, who has enough of that background to appreciate it. And by the same token, I had a young student say, this is like in Pulp Fiction when they open up the briefcase and it's a MacGuffin and it's a thing you're not supposed to have. And it doesn't matter what it really is. You just know it's forbidden. And I love that the film could work in that way for 2 very different audiences. I think it works well if you have this literary background or interest, but it also works if you don't. And you mentioned influences. One of the influences I meant to include in the intro will be made clear in my not so facetious comment here. Sometimes I think of this movie, and I shared this with Andrew kind of jokingly, sometimes I think of this movie as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, as directed by H.P. Lovecraft. That you get this twisted, psychosexual dynamic between these 2 people stuck together. But you also have all these Lovecraftian paranormal horror elements that may or may not be real, right? But they loom large in how the film presents itself. And I think, this kind of put all these influences into a blender approach. And we're talking about cinematic influences, not just literary influences. It often can backfire. I mean, there are films where people try that and it just seems really precious and, boring. But for me, at least in this film, I could appreciate all of that. And again, I didn't feel like it was a game that I had to decode the film, but that I could be I could be entertained and inspired by it, and enjoy the references that spoke to me. And of course, my students sometimes have very different reference points, and yet they loved it too. So, in fact, my students were the ones who told me to watch it. I hadn't seen it yet till a student in my class said, "You must see it."
I also would add Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Kiss Me Deadly, the Robert Aldrich sort of quasi Cold War film noir sort of, which is about which is where the Pulp Fiction element is probably taken from more directly. But absolutely, regarding the points about cinematography, which I thought were great, Robert, because what you very carefully described what your observation, and I think it was key. We have seen plenty of movies and plenty of shots that have the pan or the tilt, I guess it's a tilt up and down, but we don't usually see those in a movie that is completely, almost entirely devoid of horizontal pans, right? That this movie is, if it's going to span a distance, if it's going to give us a broad view, it's not going to be a broad view, it's going to be a tall view. And of course, that has to do with the sense of isolation. It has to do with the sense of, there are sort of Freudian and, elements to this. There are, there's some phallic symbolism to this, I think it's fair to say. And so all of those things relate to that choice to have the only sort of shots of real sort of what we'll call stationary movement. There are tracking shots, but where the camera stays still but sort of looks the way a person can look, that those are only vertical, I think was a choice that fits with other elements of the film, and a good observation by you. So thank you for sharing it.
And just to add to what Andrew's saying, I think the kind of amazing tour de force of the cinematography here is everything you're describing on the vertical dimension, and yet the sense of height, the vastness of that lighthouse, and the inability to get to the top and to see the light or whatever it represents. But at the same time, you could feel incredibly claustrophobic throughout the film and feel the close quarters of these guys. And that's a hard trick to pull off, vastness and claustrophobia all at once.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Sure.
Let's see. Diane, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, so for a while I was trying to figure out why both men had the same name, Tom. And so then I thought, well, maybe when Winslow is finally stripped of the facade and the person he was trying to be, that he wasn't that much different than the other guy. And so it was a way of kind of, at first in the movie, you think that they're very different characters, but kind of in the end, maybe they weren't all that different. So yeah, I'd like to hear your comments.
I would just say that, I'm sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Paul, that's fine.
I would just say that you're right to see them, especially once the naming is revealed, right? You're meant to see them as funhouse mirror images of one another, right? Where there's more in common than either wants to admit. By the same token, I think the film does a good job of showing the generational divide between them. I mean, assuming you accept that both of them are real characters, real people, Wake, the Defoe character, is of a much earlier period of the 19th century. He speaks, like someone that Hawthorne or Melville could have talked to. Whereas young Thomas Pattinson, his accent is different, his worldview is different. The divide between them, it feels like two Americas are living in that lighthouse. And so from that standpoint, some of my colleagues who do 19th century American history, they're fascinated by the film simply for what it says about a changing nation, after the Civil War and in the midst of technological development, et cetera.
For the last, I don't know what it is, 12 or 10 or 12 years, whenever I come across a story where someone takes an identity of a fallen colleague, I think of Mad Men. And I think that in some ways the dynamic here is similar. That both are much more complicated than I'm about to make them, but I think one element that the two share is that the person takes someone else's name because they want to be different than they are, and they want to be different than other people. But of course, you can change an identity, and you can even, go through life as Don Draper if you want. But despite having that mantle, you are still one, human; two, a man; and three, at least carry with you the same flaws and weaknesses and fears that you had before you went through that transformation. And as this film goes on, we see that happen with the unraveling of the Pattinson character. Alex, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, so kind of responding or riffing off of Diane's idea a little bit about them, having the same name and like sort of trying to come to terms with that. It's interesting to me that like there is an age gap like between the two, and like a couple of my friends have brought up like the idea that like they might be the same person, but like the younger coming to terms with the older and vice versa, throughout like temporal space or whatever. But besides that though, like I was thinking a little bit about what you guys were saying before about parody and Willem Dafoe's character being like sort of a parody of this like Captain Ahab, like whatever you want, like nautical dude. But like it makes sense that there would have to be a character that's sort of a parody, considering the film is an experience, like you guys said, right? So like he is like as much of part of the setting. He's like more a part of the setting than the character even, right? And that like he's just like there to inform this like intense, like ocean foam soaked lighthouse, rocky island setting, right? And so for him to make the setting like as alive as it is, like I feel like he almost has to be a parody. At least he is required to be a parody more than like Robert Pattinson's character would be. So yeah, sorry, that's just my thought.
No, that's really helpful. And I think it just came to my mind, your comment and one of the earlier comments about the interactions between the two men. And it goes back to what Andrew's saying about the Don Draper nature of the Pattinson character. There is a degree to which Pattinson's character calls Defoe's character on being just as much a phony. And at a certain point says, you're not the seaman you claim to be, all these experiences are just tall tales that you're spewing, for your own self-image and worth and to make me feel worse about myself. And so this idea of being inauthentic, I think it torments both of them to some degree or another. And the speech that Defoe gives, my favorite moment in the movie, the huge curse and invective from Neptune, which is the source of the image behind me, right? You have to remember too what precipitates that fight and that curse. It's that Pattinson's character doesn't like his lobster. So there's like this pathetic kind of domestic agenda behind the initial fight that leads to a curse that belongs in Paradise Lost or something. There's also all these double entendres, about spilling your beans. I leave it to all of you to go to the Urban Dictionary. But if you do, you will see a number of sexual meanings to that turn of phrase. I don't know how old they are. I think it would be interesting to research that. But this notion of being out of control, right? You're not in control of your own narrative. You're not in control of your own destiny. And this is a charge that each levels on the other at one point, and perhaps fairly.
Yeah, I think there's an element, it's one of the more surface layers, but there's certainly an element, at least in the beginning of the movie, that part of the point of this endeavor is that or part of the definition of Pattinson's character in the beginning is that he's a fish out of water, right? That this is his first time. He's the junior man. He doesn't really know what he's doing or what he's in for. And for that to be put into sort of effective relief, of course, we also have to have a fish who's very much at home in the water, as it were. And that's why we get that old salty wiki in Willem Dafoe. But at the same time, some of us in our lives may have encountered the person who overplays or unnecessarily emphasizes just how comfortable they are in a place because it's something they can lord over the new guy, so to speak. And there could be some of that as well. And Pattinson's character is picking up on that, and his resentment of it could be another motivation for that parody remark and some of the other conflict between them. Okay. Dana, you have a question or comment? Whoop.
Yep,
Oh,
here
there
I am. Okay,
Great.
there I am. I want to go ahead with the concept of spilling the beans, which I thought was that was the line that really helped me, because I'm one who has to try to decode. There's so much happening in this film, literary and Greek, Prometheus and Proteus and all the things we've been talking about, and Paul, the things you mentioned, and the cinematography. So for me, in order for me to pull something, I have to decode, kind of like I do with the Coen brothers. So here's what I came up with, and it works for me. Anyway, so I think that moment when when Dafoe says, Willem Dafoe says, "You spilled the beans," is a critical turning point here, because these are two guys who we've sort of been dancing around this, done everything they have been able to hide their real identities. And you've got to do a dance to do that. And of course, the alcohol is what has moved them into this new place, which is something that Robert Pattinson didn't want to touch. We saw that at the beginning of the movie, but now they're both getting drunk. And at that moment, when Pattinson admits his past, he's crossed a line that I think is going to change everything, because that's where you just plain cannot go. If you do go there, then you're breaking some sort of a rule, and it's a rule of closeness that neither one of these guys can do. And I thought when they were doing that dance together, where it was almost sexual, but certainly wasn't, that was the closest that they were coming. There was another moment where they were patching up windows together. There were so few moments where they helped one another. And I thought that the simple message that I was able to take from this film, and it was so sad, really, more sad than horror, is that if only they could have reached out from their mistaken identities and tried to help each other, kind of like, forgive me, people are doing during the pandemic. Just reach out and help a troubled soul. I'm not sure that a lot of this psychological mumbo jumbo wouldn't have really gone away, or at least lessened for both of them, but they couldn't do it. And therefore the wheels had to continue to spin, and therefore there was such a downward spiral. But I saw them, I don't want to belabor it, but there was just a moment where maybe it could have happened because it was out there for them to do, and they simply couldn't do it. And it was a guy thing too. That's the other thing that hit me. This was two men, was clearly not women. This is a film about men and things that men have to do. And anyway, so that was my take on it. And that's what helped me kind of understand, which I need to do when I watch a movie that's this fraught and this impactful.
So to your point, Dana, I think I'm responding in a similar way to you to that spill your beans discussion between them when they're drunk, not only on alcohol stores, but also I think turpentine by that point. So all bets are off. I think you're right. There is a disappointment in the Dafoe character at Pattinson telling that much of the truth about his life and his journey. And in a strange way for these guys, right? The intimacy that they're forging is in some bizarre way threatened by too much honesty. I'm reminded here of the opening episode of The Sopranos, when Tony Soprano's bemoaning the loss of Gary Coopers in the world, whatever happened to Gary Cooper. And he says at one point, you know, if Gary Cooper had been like me and gone to therapy, you wouldn't get him to shut up. You know, if he starts opening up about his problems, that's the last thing anybody needs. And I feel like, you know, Defoe is in that vein. You know, we have a good thing going here. I mean, objectively, it doesn't seem to be, but they have a relationship being forged, and it really is dependent upon the historical fictions of their lives, the lie agreed upon, right? And that's violated. There's too much honesty from Pattinson in that moment, and that begins the downward spiral in that relationship. We would think it ought not to do that, but it does.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a level of honesty there that even in the same circumstances, plenty of 21st century men wouldn't be comfortable with, let alone a couple of 19th century men, right? And that, you know, the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. Well, these two are going to be, by nature of their mission, way more familiar with each other without even trying than for enough contempt to take hold. So to sort of, you know, it's a phrase that wasn't around at that time, obviously. It's a phrase I personally find annoying, but to TMI, right? Too much information is a bit of what's happening there.
And the close quarters of all this, I mentioned this in the intro, right? For a film that was made in 2019, there isn't a better film about 2020, you know, about living in close quarters with people under really dire circumstances. And the film is brutally honest about that. And if you add into that already volatile mix of close quarters, toxic masculinity, all bets are off.
Right. My before he went back to in-person school, my 5.5-year-old was he's nowhere near toxically masculine, but I think he was looking for turpentine at one point. So this is unbelievably prescient, given when it was made and released. Absolutely. Ross, you have a question or comment?
Yeah. First of all, what a great movie. Oh my God, it just kind of mesmerized me the whole time. So I'd like the comment about the light, the introduction of the light being a sort of interpreted as a MacGuffin, you know, that's something that you could just take from that perspective, or either the literary aspect of it. But thinking about the MacGuffin idea, so there was that Hitchcockian quality to this movie with the introduction of the birds, that the whole mystical aspect, or the mystical aspect being sort of introduced by the coming of the birds, and the birds representing the lost souls of sailors,
Mm-hmm.
and started attacking him, and then being threatened, and then poisoning the water, and then that leading to the tentacles and the mermaid and that whole mystical aspect. So it's like the movie has this whole underpinning of mysticism that you could almost be looked at separately, but yet, you know, very much woven into the whole theme of it. I don't know where I'm going with any of this, but just the tentacles and the birds, it just added this whole incredible aspect to the film.
On the birds, Ross, I couldn't agree more. And I totally see the Hitchcock echo. What I love is that simultaneously, this is a Coleridge echo. So the Rime of the Ancient Mariner killing the albatross, you know, a doomed ship, you know, of men who have to pay the price for one other man's mistake. You know, you can go in both directions with it. And again, not every film can navigate being referential in those two ways, but this one somehow does. At least for me, it sounds like for you.
Well, and to my mind, the more sort of interesting and mature elements of the movie The Birds is what happens inside, you know, Jessica Tandy's house when she has to be in there with her son that she has an unhealthy affection for, and the woman who's interested in him that she deeply resents, and her oddly much younger daughter. And that, that element of the individuals being put in this crucible and their sort of psychological knives coming out is, of course, the main focus of the Lighthouse, but it's sort of a secondary element of the presence of the birds. But both function, I think, as Ross was getting at, in a similar way, which was, yes, something unusual that we can't really explain is happening here, and just accept it, because what it is going to facilitate, or what it predicates, I guess, is far more interesting than the question of how is this real? Is Willem Dafoe really right that that's what seagulls are? Don't worry about that. Look at what happens after Pattinson does, whether it's coincidence or not or whatever. Let's see. Alex, you have another question or comment?
Yeah, so I'm kind of also reminded of, we were talking about the sort of references to the Melville, the Lovecraft, but there's almost like this kind of like Fall of the House of Usher vibe to the film too, because Pattinson's character is sort of charged with like maintaining the house that they live in, but like it's impossible for him to like continue to maintain it, right? So the house is like sort of continually falling apart until like the end of the movie, when it just like gets washed out and like all the stuff in the house is thrown around and everything is basically destroyed. And that like kind of mirrors like the decay of their minds and the decay of their relationship. But it's interesting though, because like even though like ostensibly they're both there to like maintain the lighthouse, it kind of like is the only thing still standing at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Which
you
is
feel like
interesting.
it's still there.
Yeah.
I think too, what you're getting at is the situation of unfairness that Pattinson points out, because yeah, they should both be maintaining it, but it's clear that Defoe is throwing all of that on him in this kind of abusive relationship that plays out so darkly.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that this might be the case, but I think that to the extent that this movie wants us to entertain the possibility that we're to think of this as more as a more sort of traditional domestic relationship, whether it's a romantic or sexual one or not, but a more domestic relationship, that there's the one partner who's put upon with an inordinate amount of the quote unquote domestic labor, while the other one does the thing, that the special thing, unique thing that really doesn't seem to be rocket science, and certainly if it can be done naked with your tentacles hanging out, then it can't be all that detailed work anyway. Paul, we don't currently have any hands up, but I was hoping that you could just talk a little bit about the sort of Prometheus and Proteus sort of I guess lanes that the two main characters seem to fall into.
Yeah, I mean, certainly on the Prometheus side, someone already pointed out in the chat, right? The ending image is very similar to what happens to Prometheus. And Prometheus is a figure who has been viewed in two ways, sometimes simultaneously over the centuries. One is as someone who commits a crime against the gods, right? He has a hubris that he exercises on the behalf of all humanity, right? He's stealing fire for us. But he gets, from a certain point of view, rightfully punished by the gods, and his entrails are picked away. And so this idea of him, all the things he's done in the film, killing the bird, all the rest, but also daring to scale the lighthouse, go to the top, a little bit of echo of maybe the Tower of Babel there too, that results in his comeuppance. But of course, at other times, especially in the 19th century, among the Romantic poets, Prometheus was a bit of a hero. You know, he was the person willing to put it all on the line against the gods, no matter what they might do to him. And so this kind of multivalent way of looking at hubris in the film, I think, is something the film is interested in. There's a shared curiosity on our part with Pattinson. It's not like we don't want to know what's up at the top of that lighthouse either. Although, at least in one scene in the middle of the film, you decide you don't want to go up there because of what Defoe's doing up there. But that doesn't change the ultimate drive of Pattinson's character. You know, because the first thing that happens once Wake is actually dead is, you know, I can go up there now. I've got the keys. And we all know that those acts of hubris often backfire on us. And so the closing image echoes that Greek story, you know, beautifully.
And Proteus was sort of, you know, someone who kind of served Poseidon.
Right.
And, you know, if we think of Poseidon as the god of the ocean or the sea, and we think of Willem Dafoe as the keeper of all the old salty wiki lore stuff, then that kind of fits there, particularly when on at least a couple of occasions we see him depicted as having sort of, you know, sea creature like features and elements to his body, even if only fleetingly, which is, I think, sometimes how Proteus was depicted. So so there's that element there of that mythical figure.
You also have that striking image of Defoe in kind of godlike Neptune, Protean posture, arresting Pattinson's character, you know, with a blaze from his eyes. And some of you may know there's a Sasha Snyder painting that is exactly like that. And it's a homoerotic painting. And Eggers consciously riffs on that image, which I think is a 19th century work, while at the same time riffing on all the things that go back to the Greeks.
We got a request in the chat to talk about the square framing, and you mentioned some of this, I think, in your introduction, Paul. But to me, a large part of it, we've already talked about how it has to do with claustrophobia and, you know, the sort of the restrictions and constrictions on these characters. But I think, as the image behind you is reminding me, that is also the image aspect ratio of the German Expressionist era, by and large, and that he's going for very much for that aesthetic in many ways, not just with the cinematography, but also with elements of the performance, certainly. And so I think that fits, that those two sort of elements are reason enough to justify the relatively square frame. I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, I mean, you nailed it. And so many other films are brought to mind by this film in a really productive way. And again, my students were kind of inspiring in the classroom. They aren't always, but often they are. And in this case, when they told me to go watch The Lighthouse, one of the reasons they did is we were just talking about and looking at clips from German Expressionist films. So they made that connection. And I said, well, I must be missing something. So listen to your students.
That's great. Yes, a good reminder to all of us. Robert, you had another question or comment?
Oh, just something unusual I thought I saw in the cinematography. There was a super close-up on Thomas's eye. And that's a pretty unusual thing, I think, in my experience in film. I saw that, I believe, in Hitchcock's Psycho, while she's being killed in the shower. I believe that the camera goes so close that all you see is her eye in the frame. And I saw that in Renoir's. Renoir did that in his trip. It's called Trip to the Country. And some of the commentators said that was one of the greatest film moments when you, in that picture. Anyway, so I just thought that, but I don't think you'd ever see going to someone's eye like that. That really would be a sign of the German Expressionism, right? If you just frame an eye with nothing else.
Well, I don't know if I necessarily think of that so much as being, from that particular movement, but I do think of it as being a way to show us in the audience something so shocking, so appalling,
Right.
so horrifying, so overwhelming, without actually being able to show it. You show the reaction to it,
Right.
and you see that. It's also a way to communicate that what is being seen is very, very meaningful for the person seeing it. So not only do you see it in Psycho, when you don't only see Marion's eyes close up in the shower scene, you see Norman's eyes when he is watching her undress, because he is seeing something that for him is extremely impactful, and as the film unfolds, we realize quite motivating as well. And so you very often see those extreme close-ups of eyes. Think about 2001, when Bowman is going through the, I don't know what you call it, the portal,
Stargate.
and
Yeah.
the Stargate.
Yeah, that's what some call
Yeah.
it. You call it what you want.
Yeah, and we, not only does the color change and there's all these interesting effects, but what we're seeing there is his face and his eye blinking, because the film has no chance of showing us something that will match the meaning conveyed by the reaction of that overwhelmed eye that is so full with the sight of something wonderful, I guess. So I think that's how that's being used.
And would you see that in the silent film era? Wouldn't you see that?
You would see that sometimes in silent films, particularly in the horror genre. I don't think of it as being, I think of it more of as a close-up on the face than more so than simply the eye. But you're absolutely right. And as Joss mentioned in the chat and Paul commented on, one of the most striking avant-garde films ever made, the Buñuel short film An Andalusian Dog, Un Chien Andalou, has a very famous scene of a close-up of an eye, and that eye being injured, let's say, so as not to freak people out too much. So there's definitely something there. And of course, a filmmaker like Hitchcock is very much aware of the movie-going apparatus and the process of people watching, and this being about not just what's on screen, but about the people watching it happen while it is on screen. And I think this film has some awareness of that, right? I mean, there is an element implicit in that, is an element of how the human mind works, and this movie is obviously very interested in how the human mind works. And so I think that there are some connections there. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions, so I guess we can wrap things up. Paul, do you have any last remarks or thoughts to share?
No, but I did want to reiterate, what a wonderful experience this is for me, and I hope for students too. And I really encourage you to support Bremer Film Institute during some difficult times here. And I know many of you already do, but anything you can do, including this participation tonight, these are all ways of keeping the Institute vibrant until we get back to something closer to normal, away from the lighthouse.
Thanks very much, Paul. And thank you so much for suggesting this film that, was the start to, I think, a very interesting conversation. And I'm sure you encouraged a lot of people to see it who hadn't seen it before, just as your students did for you. So that's terrific. Thanks so much. Thank you all very much for joining us. We do have a number of our Tuesday night seminars coming up. If you are interested in German Expressionism after hearing us talk about it today, you can join Lisa tonight for part one of her two-part seminar on Fritz Lang, one of the practitioners of German cinema during that era, She's going to be doing a two-part seminar on Fritz Lang, one his work in Germany and the other part later on his work in Hollywood. We have another one of our short film seminars coming up with film critic Gary Kramer. And Paul Wright, it's not up here on the screen, but Paul is teaching one of our seminars on Breaking Bad coming up at the beginning of April. I want to say, is it the 6th? Does that sound right?
Sounds right. You have to look.
No, it's the 6th because it would be 2 weeks, I think 2 weeks before the one I'm doing on the Oscars on the 20th. But anyway, it's just been added to our website, so you can certainly sign up for that. As is evidence.
If I can say, Andrew, it's also a course that, a seminar that could be taken by anyone who'd done longer courses on the show with me before. We're going to go in some new directions, build on some things.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that, Paul. Right. Paul has taught a couple of courses on Breaking Bad for us in the past, but with the distance since the series has ended, and in addition, Paul, as you can see, Paul's very strong ability to make connections that might not be obvious to the rest of us. I'm sure he's made some new connections for Breaking Bad since he taught those courses. So that should be a very interesting evening as well. Please visit brynmarfilm.org and check out the Film Studies Online section and sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, we send out our education email that tells you what the movie to be discussed the following Monday is, has a link to the instructor's introduction, like Paul's wonderful one for the Lighthouse that was sent out in the last Thursday email, and a bunch of other things, links to our Ask Andrew mini lessons and wonderful film-themed word puzzles and all sorts of great stuff. We also have at brynmarfilm.org Theater 5, where we are showing online. We have a virtual cinema online where you can see films that you can't really see anywhere else through our website. And of course, those support us, and all the programs you attend that helps support the Institute until we are able to reopen, as Paul said. But if you are able to support us with an additional donation, we certainly would very much appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you all back in the theater for education soon. I should say that we are currently open for theater rentals at some very reasonable rates for a theater rental for you and your family. So you can find out more about that on our website as well. Until next time, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you very much, Paul, for another wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody.